The year is 1314. Scotland has been at war for nearly 2 decades. Fathers have fought and died. Sons have taken up their fathers' swords. And through it all, one question hangs over everything. Will Scotland survive? At the centre of this struggle stands a man who killed his rival in a church, who was crowned king in secret, and who spent years hiding in caves while English armies hunted him like an animal. His name is Robert the Bruce, and in just a few days he will face the largest army ever assembled to crush Scotland. This is the story of the Battle of Bannockburn, a battle where everything was on the line, a battle that would decide whether Scotland would be free or forever under England's boot. Let's set the stage. By 1314, Robert Bruce had been fighting for 8 years to secure his throne and drive the English from Scotland. He'd used hit-and-run tactics, nighttime raids, and clever strategy to recapture castle after castle. But 2 major fortresses remained in English hands, Berwick on the border and the mighty Stirling Castle, which controlled the main route north into the Scottish Highlands. In February 1313, Robert's brother Edward laid siege to Stirling. The castle's English governor, Sir Philip de Mowbray, made an unusual deal. He would surrender the castle if no English army came to relieve him by June 24th, 1314, Midsummer's Day. The relieving army would need to come within 3 miles of the castle by that date. When Robert heard about this agreement, he was furious. His brother had just forced England's hand. Now King Edward II would have no choice but to invade Scotland with everything he had. Edward II was not like his father, Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots. The younger Edward was weak, indecisive and unpopular with his own nobles, but he couldn't ignore this challenge. If he let Stirling fall without a fight, he'd look like a coward. So in the spring of 1314, he began gathering an army, the largest invasion force Scotland had ever faced. The numbers were staggering. Edward assembled somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 men. About 13,000 were infantry, foot soldiers armed with swords, axes and bows. Among them were 3,000 Welsh archers, famous for their deadly accuracy. And then there were the cavalry, roughly 3,000 heavy knights in full armour, riding massive war horses bred for battle. But getting nobles to join wasn't easy. Edward had to send 3 separate summons. 4 of his most powerful earls didn't even bother to show up. Morale was low. The army was massive, but it was fractured. In late May, Edward began his march north from Berwick. He pushed his army hard. They covered 70 miles in a single week. The soldiers were exhausted, hungry and footsore before they even reached the battlefield. Edward wasn't leading an army. He was dragging one. Meanwhile, Robert Bruce was preparing. He had nowhere near the numbers the English had. His army numbered only about 6,000 to 7,000 men. Almost all were foot soldiers, simple men armed with long spears. He had maybe 500 light cavalry, nothing compared to England's armoured knights. But Bruce had something more valuable than numbers: time to prepare and the perfect location. He chose his battleground carefully, a wooded area called the New Park, near a small stream called the Bannockburn. The terrain was marshy, with bogs and soft ground that would bog down heavy cavalry. The woods would protect his soldiers from being flanked, and the stream itself, the Bannockburn, created a natural barrier. Bruce divided his army into 4 divisions, called schiltrons. These were tight formations of spearmen who would stand together like a human hedgehog, with spears pointing in every direction. The 1st division was led by Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, the 2nd by his brother Edward Bruce, the 3rd by James Douglas and young Walter the Steward. Bruce himself commanded the 4th division and the reserves, 500 light cavalry under Sir Robert Keith, and then Bruce added his secret weapon. His men dug concealed pits across the front of their position and along the banks of the stream. These pits were covered with branches and grass. When English knights charged on their heavy horses, the ground would give way beneath them. From March to June, Bruce drilled his men every single day. They practiced forming schiltrons, moving as one, keeping their spears level. These weren't professional soldiers. Many were farmers, craftsmen, ordinary men. But Bruce turned them into a unified fighting force. On the morning of June 23rd, 1314, No one knew if there would actually be a battle. The armies were still 8 miles apart. Bruce could have retreated north across the River Forth or west into the hills, but he made his choice. He would stand and fight. The English army appeared on the road from Falkirk around midday. When Scottish scouts first caught sight of them, they were stunned. The English covered the road to the horizon, banners from England, France, Brittany, Germany flapping in the wind. It looked like an unstoppable tide. Edward had brought 10 full divisions. His plan was simple: use overwhelming force to smash through the Scottish lines and relieve Stirling Castle. But then something unexpected happened. A group of English cavalry, about 300 knights led by Sir Robert Clifford and Sir Henry de Bohun, tried to circle around the Scottish position to reach Stirling directly. They rode close to the River Forth, hoping to avoid the main Scottish army. Thomas Randolph saw them. His division rushed to intercept, and a fierce fight broke out. The English knights charged again and again, but the Scottish spearmen held firm. The schiltron worked exactly as Bruce had planned. The wall of spears was impenetrable. Eventually, battered and bleeding, the English knights retreated. Meanwhile, another drama was unfolding at the front. Robert Bruce was riding along his lines on a small, nimble horse. Not a war horse, just a riding pony. He was surveying the field, checking his positions, and then he was spotted. Sir Henry de Bohun, a young English knight hungry for glory, saw the Scottish king. This was his chance for immortal fame. If he could kill Robert Bruce, the war would be over. Edward would reward him beyond measure. His name would live forever. De Bohun lowered his lance, spurred his massive war horse, and charged. Bruce was caught out in the open. His men watched in horror. The king was on a small horse with only a battle axe for defence. He should have fled, but if he ran, the entire Scottish army would see their king fleeing from a single knight. Morale would shatter. So Bruce did something insane. He held his ground. As de Bohun thundered toward him, lance levelled, Bruce waited. At the last possible second, he swerved his agile horse aside. The lance missed, and in one fluid motion, Bruce rose in his stirrups and brought his axe down with all his strength. The blade split de Bohun's helmet. It split his skull. The English knight toppled from his horse, dead before he hit the ground. A great roar went up from the Scottish lines. Bruce rode back to his men, and his commanders rushed to him. "You broke the shaft of your axe," one said. Bruce just grinned. "Aye," he replied. "That's my only regret." That single moment changed everything. The Scots had seen their king defeat an armoured knight in single combat. They believed they could win. As night fell on June 23rd, both armies made camp, but they were in very different situations. The Scottish soldiers rested in the woods, eating, talking, their spirits high after the day's victories. Bruce moved among them, encouraging them, telling them that tomorrow would bring glory or freedom. The English, however, were in trouble. Edward had made a critical mistake. Instead of camping on the high ground, he'd ordered his massive army to cross the Bannockburn and camp on the marshy ground on the other side. His reasoning was simple. He wanted to be closer to Stirling Castle. But now his army of 15,000 to 20,000 men was crammed into a narrow space, hemmed in by the stream behind them and marsh on either side. The horses sank into the soft ground. The men were packed so tightly they could barely move, and they were exhausted from the forced march. Some English nobles began to whisper that they should wait, rest, attack fresh the next day. The Earl of Gloucester counselled Edward to wait, but Edward's pride was stung. He'd been accused of cowardice before. He wouldn't be called a coward again. "We attack at dawn," Edward declared. Sunday, June 24th, 1314. Midsummer's Day. At dawn, the Scottish soldiers were awakened. The elderly, blind abbot of Incheffray celebrated Mass for the army. Then Robert Bruce addressed his men one final time. "Any man who does not have the stomach for this fight may leave now with no shame," he called out. A great roar answered him. No one left. Bruce gave the order, and the Scottish army emerged from the woods. The English couldn't believe their eyes. The Scots were advancing, not defending, not hiding behind walls, but marching forward in tight formation, their schiltrons bristling with spears. Edward ordered the attack. His cavalry charged, hundreds of armoured knights on massive war horses, the ground shaking beneath them, and then they hit the schiltrons. Imagine a forest of spears moving as one. As the English cavalry charged, they slammed into this wall of iron points. Horses screamed and fell. Knights were thrown from their saddles. The concealed pits opened up beneath the charging horses, sending riders crashing down. The schiltrons held, but the English kept coming. Wave after wave of cavalry charged, trying to break through. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, with spears, axes and swords. Men fell on both sides. The ground turned to mud, mixed with blood. The English had overwhelming numbers, but they couldn't use them. The marshy ground and narrow space meant only the front ranks could fight. Behind them, thousands of English soldiers stood uselessly, unable to reach the battle. They were too tightly packed to manoeuvre, too crowded to retreat. Meanwhile, the Scottish cavalry under Sir Robert Keith swept around the English flank and scattered the Welsh archers before they could do significant damage. The tide was turning. The Earl of Gloucester, trying to prove his courage after Edward had questioned his loyalty, charged directly into the Scottish lines. He was cut down and killed. When the English soldiers saw one of their greatest nobles fall, panic began to spread. Men at the back, unable to see what was happening, heard the screams and started to pull back. The retreat began as a trickle, then became a flood. And then, from a nearby hill called Gillies Hill, thousands of figures appeared. The Scottish small folk, the camp followers, servants and wives who'd been watching the battle. They grabbed whatever weapons they could find, sticks, rocks, farming tools, and came running down the hill, screaming. The English, already breaking, thought it was a fresh Scottish army. The retreat became a rout. Edward II himself fled the field, surrounded by his personal bodyguard. His departure sealed it. The English army dissolved into chaos, every man for himself. The Scots pursued them to the Bannockburn. Men tried to cross the stream in full armour and drowned. Others were cut down as they ran. The stream ran red. One English knight, Giles de Argentine, refused to flee. He was one of the most famous knights in Europe, a veteran of the Crusades. When he saw Edward fleeing, he said, "I am not accustomed to flee, nor shall I do so now." He turned his horse, charged back into the Scottish lines, and died fighting. The slaughter continued for miles. Of the massive English army, only about 3,000 soldiers made it back to England alive. Dozens of English nobles lay dead on the field, including the Earl of Gloucester, William Marshal, Robert Clifford, and many others. The Scots claimed they lost only a few hundred men. The Battle of Bannockburn was over. Against impossible odds, Robert Bruce had won the most decisive victory in Scottish history. But this wasn't the end of the war. England refused to recognise Scottish independence for another 14 years. Edward II wouldn't formally give up his claim to Scotland. The fighting continued, with Scottish armies raiding deep into northern England. But Bannockburn changed everything. It proved Scotland could not be conquered. It legitimised Robert Bruce as the true King of Scots, and it gave the Scottish people something they desperately needed: hope. In 1320, Scottish nobles sent a letter to the Pope called the Declaration of Arbroath. It declared Scotland's independence and Robert as their rightful king. And finally, in 1328, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton was signed. England officially recognised Scotland as an independent nation and Robert Bruce as its king. Robert had done it. He'd taken a broken, occupied country and made it free. Today, the Battle of Bannockburn is remembered as Scotland's greatest military victory. There's a visitor centre near Stirling where you can walk the battlefield and see where these events unfolded over 700 years ago. The story of Robert Bruce inspires people to this day. There's even a famous legend about him. Before Bannockburn, after suffering defeat after defeat, Bruce supposedly hid in a cave, despairing. He watched a spider trying to spin its web, failing again and again, but the spider never gave up. On its 7th try, it succeeded. Bruce took that lesson to heart. If at first you don't succeed, try again. Whether that story is true or not, the real story is even more powerful. Robert Bruce was a man who refused to give up. He lost battles, lost friends, lost everything at times. But he kept fighting. He made hard choices, learned from his mistakes, and when the moment came at Bannockburn, he was ready. On June 23rd and 24th, 1314, roughly 7,000 Scottish soldiers defeated an army 3 times their size. They did it through preparation, smart tactics, courage, and the leadership of a king who wouldn't surrender. The Battle of Bannockburn didn't just win Scotland's freedom, it showed that with determination, clever thinking and unity, even the impossible can be achieved. And that's a lesson worth remembering.